Hi, good afternoon. It is a huge honor, kavod gadol, that Rav Dr. Yakov Nagen accepted our invitation to learn the first sugya of Kiddushin with us today. Also, a big thank you to Rabbi Dratch and to Rabbi Roy Feldman for putting together this wonderful convention that has had a great start. Rav Nagen is a PhD in Jewish philosophy from Hebrew University, and he is a senior educator at Yeshivat Otniel, where he teaches both Gemara and Kabbalah. He's also the director of Or Torah Stone's Beit Midrash for Judaism and Humanity. He is a leading figure in interfaith dialogue between Judaism and Islam and in encounters between Judaism and Eastern religions. Rav Nagen, thank you so much for joining us and for teaching us today.
Okay, thank you for that warm introduction. For many years, every shiur I begin with the Hebrew date as a constant reminder, just like today's date is unique, today is unique, and that's a thought that helps push me living this day the way it should be. Hayom, Yud Gimel Sivan, Taf, Shin, Pei Aleph. Ze hayom asa Adonai nagila v'nismecha bo. Today, we'll be dealing with the first parak of Mishnah Kiddushin. I think it impacts on the sugyot throughout the Masechet, but the focus itself will be on the Mishnah. But let me begin with a story connected to the sugya that we will learn today, and also connected to some of the recent events in Israel. In the first response of Israel to the missile attacks from Gaza was in 2009, what was called Ofrat Yitzukah. Now, the first Israeli soldier that fell in that campaign was Dvir Amanuelov. And it was a very moving story because Dvir's father had passed away a year before that. And even though he was exempted from combat, he chose nevertheless to go and fight. But after the war, his mother contacted me and told me that when Dvir's father passed away, Dvir began a chavruta with his mother, Li'ilui Nishmat, his father, in my book, Nishmat Mishnah. And she said, do you know what the last chapter we learned together before Dvir fell? And without even thinking, despite there being more than 50 chapters to the book, I knew what she would tell me. In fact, the last chapter they studied together is the chapter that we'll be studying today, in which I argue that a pasuk underlying the first chapter of Mishnah Kiddushin is the pasuk Veheshiv lev avot al banim velev banim al avotam. So their chavruta, which is a connection between the son and the mother, to connect up to the father, this was their last encounter together. So Bezat Hashem, this limud should be Le'iloi Nishmat Dvir ben Dalia. Okay, so we're going to begin with the middle of the parak, but ultimately hope to branch out to the entirety of the first parak of Kiddushin. The Mishnah teaches us that there are two categories of mitzvot relating to the family. There are the mitzvot of the ben al ha'av, and there are mitzvot ha'av al haben. Now, in all manuscripts of the Mishnah, this order is reversed, meaning first mitzvot ha'av al haben, and then mitzvot haben al ha'av. And this is significant because this helps highlight the first point I would like to make today, to argue that there's a intertextual connection between that Mishnah, and as we'll see, other Mishnayot in Kiddushin, to the closing pasuk in Sefer of Sifrei Nevi'im that tells us about the mission of Eliyahu Navi, which is Veheshiv lev avot al banim v'lev banim al avotam. And I'll do a share screen now. And as we could see on the share screen, how the similarities between the pasuk and the Mishnah. Both the pasuk, they both deal with the relationships between fathers and son, a bilateral relationship, first from the father to the son, and then the son to the father. They even both use the preposition al to describe this relationship. In fact, the most significant difference is that whereas the pasuk talks about lev, heart, a linking of avot ubanim through the heart, the Mishnah uses the word mitzvat, talks about a linkage based on mitzvot. Now, often people are more enthusiastic about the lev than possibly the mitzvot, but I think there's a telling point that we could take from Rav Kook's famous article, Chacham Adif Menavi. Rav Kook shows that the prophet often are like great poets and visionaries with very powerful visions, whereas the Chacham, which is the Torah Sheba'al Peh, often deals with the nitty-gritty of details in life. The argument of Rav Kook is that ultimately the Nevi'im failed. As poetic as the Nevi'im were, Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, Yecheskel, their Nevuot did not stop the Churban, did not stop Am Yisrael from the Chatayim that they were doing. Whereas the Chacham, Dafka, by dealing with the nitty-gritty, the details, this is what led to a change in Am Yisrael. So therefore, when I look at the Pasuk in Malachi and I compare it to the Mishnah and Kiddushin, they're both talking about relations between Avot Ubanim, a bilateral, but by going from the lev, the heart, to mitzvot, something which will define the relationship, what it means to be a father to your son, what it means to be a child to your father, your parent. By defining this, this is the way we could fulfill that vision of the heart. So we're not replacing it, but we're understanding that to achieve the vision of connecting the heart, we're going to need the mitzvot. Now, I'd like to make a methodological point, which is true in general about Mishnah, which is often the Tanakh is in the background of Mishnayot. This is true about Bavli and Shalmi as well, but Mishnah in particular, in many instances that the Mishnah does not quote pasukim, there is a pasuk underlying the Mishnah, underlying the images in the Mishnah. I'll bring just one example from another context. Masechet Tamid tells us the story about a day in the life of the Beit HaMikdash at the bringing of the Korban Tamid. During the night, the Kohanim are sleeping in the Mikdash, and in the morning, the Memuneh comes. Now, when the Mishnah describes the coming of the Memuneh to open up the Mikdash, it talks about Hu dofek vehem potchim lo. Now, the word dofek appears only once in Tanakh. In Shir Hashirim, kol dodi dofek. Dofek appears only once in the Mishnah. And in both of them, the continuation is pitchuli, opening up. And this is a point which throughout Masechet Tamid, psukim and imagery of Shir Hashirim are underlying the description of the Avodat Beit HaMikdash. Okay, and I'm glad for comments during and comments also at the end. So please feel free to people to respond. Okay, now after that methodological point, let me go back to our parak. And again, to state, when finding intertextual connections, it's very important to not be based on one point. Things on one point could be merely associative, coincidence, and therefore, if you do feel when studying a sugya, Mishnah or Bavli Yishalmi, that there's something underlying the text, it's very important to try to expand it to see that this isn't only one point of contact. So I would like to continue with other Mishnayot to show how significant this Nevuah of Malachi is to our parak. Now, In the Mishnah itself, after telling us about the mitzvot ha'av al ben, the mitzvot ha'ben al av, at the end, the Mishnah continues to tell us the connection between mitzvot and Eretz Yisrael. If you go to the last Mishnah of the Perek, Kol oseh mitzvah achat, metivim lo umarichim lo yamav v'nochel et haaretz. Through mitzvot, we are zochet to inherit the land. V'kol she'eino oseh mitzvah achat, ein metivim lo, ve'ein merichim lo yamav, ve'eino nochel et haaretz. There's a connection between mitzvot and nachlat haaretz. Now the Mishnah continues, Kol sheyeshno b'mikra uvemishnah uvederech eretz lo b'mehera uchoteh shenamar v'achut ha'meshulash lo meher yinatek v'chol she'eino lo b'mikra v'lo mishnah v'derech eretz eino mini yishuv. Now on this Mishnah there was a beautiful point made by Rav Avram Wolfish, was one of the great pioneers in Limud Mishnah in our times. And he points out how this Mishnah is so connected to the Mishnah of Avot al Banim. Because what are the mitzvot that an Av is chayiv to his son? There's Brit Milah and Pidyon Ben, which are moments in time. But the bulk of the mitzvot, it's Torah, lelamdo Torah, velamdo derech eretz. That's how the Tosefta explains the mitzvot ha'av al ben. And what is the Mishnah here telling us? It's telling us that if someone is b'mikrov mishnah v'derech eretz, meaning somebody, if the father succeeds and the son has Torah and has derech eretz, then the Masorah will continue. If he does not have Torah and he does not have derech eretz, einam in yishuv, he'll be cut off from the yishuv. Now, so what is this Mishnah telling us? It's telling us the result of the fulfillment or non-fulfillment of the mitzvot ha'av al ben. Now, how does this go back to the argument I began with, that we're dealing with, that underlying our chapter is that nevuah in Sefer Malachi? Because if you go to the pasuk in Malachi, the pasuk says, V'heshiv levavot al banim v'lev banu al votam. And what's the continuation? Pen avo v'keti et haaretz cherem. If this does not happen, if there is not hashavat avot al banim v'banim al avotam, then the land will be smited cherem. And this exactly is the structure of the Mishnah. The Mishnah tells us, first the Mishnah teaches us that about the mitzvot ha-ben al-av, mitzvot ha-av al-ben, mitzvot ha-ben al-av. And then as a result, the result, as we said before, if this is not going to be fulfilled, then what's the result? Ein lo b'mikra lo mishnah v'derech eretz. There is a failure. The son does not get Torah and derech eretz from his father. Eino mina yishuv. This is v'keti teretz cherem. So here we see that the second half of this chapter of the Mishnah Kiddushin is paralleling, the two parts of the second half are paralleling the two halves of this last verse of Nevi'im. Okay, so now after contemplating the Mishnah, before we get to the first half of the Perek and the relation between the first half to the second half, this interpretation of the Mishnah could give us a new insight in a mystery that I think baffled many of the commentaries in Nevi'im through the ages. If I ask most people what the pasuk v'heshiv lev avot al banim v'lev banu avotam, who is this referring to? What is this pasuk saying? Most people would assume this is talking about relationships between fathers and sons. Surprisingly, almost none of the Rishonim explained it that way. Rashi, for example, says, "What's v'heshiv lev avot?" It's not returning the father to the son, it's returning lakadosh baruch hu, al banim, al yedei banim. The pasuk comes saying that the fathers through the sons will come back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the sons through the fathers will be coming to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. whereas the Radak says it. Ve'eshiv lev avot al banim kmo im banim. With the fathers, with the sons, will be choser b'tshuva. Now, certainly, being choser b'tshuva and getting back to Kadosh Baruch Hu is a great ideal. But it would seem that this pasuk is telling us something about the relationships between fathers and sons. Why is it that the commentaries are not giving the simple explanation to the pasuk? So that mikra, first of all, it points out that Chazal did understand the pasuk kipshuto, because, for example, the last Mishnah in Masechet Ediot ends by telling us that the role of Eliyahu Navi is that Eliyahu Navi is going to be coming lo lerachek, lo lekrev, elo lasot shalom ba'olam, shenemar hine anochi sholech lechem et Eliyahu Navi ve'eshiv levavot al banim v'leiban al avotam. Chazal clearly understanding that avot ubanim is talking about interpersonal relations. Here about shalom ba'olam. So that Mitra asks, why is it that the commentaries did not explain it in this way? And that Mikra answers is because the last chapter of Malachi starts the question. Am Yisrael asks, B'ma nashuv, how can we return to a Kadosh Baruch Hu? If the question is how to get back to Kadosh Baruch Hu, presumably the answer is about returning to God and not about returning to each other. I think that our chapter is giving a solution to this riddle about how both this last verse of Nevi'im could be answering the question, B'ma nashuv, how to get back to Kadosh Baruch Hu, and nevertheless be talking about interpersonal relations between fathers and sons. And this is because the pasuk says, Zichru Torah Moshe Avdi, remember the Torah of Moshe, Asher tzeviti oto b'chorev, al kol Yisrael chukim mishpatim. Remember the Torah of Moshe, which I commanded in Chorev. Now, the big question is, how on earth are we going to remember the Torah in Chorev? Mamad Har Sinai was 3,500 years ago. What gives us to get back to Kadosh Baruch Hu? We must remember the Torah. But how can we remember the Torah? And the answer is, the way that we will remember the Torah of Moshe is through Heshiv levavot al banim v'leiban al avotam. If we are able to, if the fathers connect to the children, are fill their roles as a father to the children, if the children fill their roles, and the Mishnah says this is about the father teaching Torah to the children respecting and honoring the father, this is how we will remember the Torah of Moshe. So the Mishnah in Kiddushin, in a subtle way, is ultimately giving us an interpretation and an understanding of this last chapter of Malachi. One word before we go on to the first half of the parak. I remember once hearing from Rabbi Yonatan Zaks. He said that in the ancient world, two people sought immortality: Am Yisrael and the Egyptians. The Egyptians built magnificent monuments to withstand the winds of time. They built the pyramids to achieve eternity. Am Yisrael achieves eternity by Moshe Rabbeinu. The first thing he has to say to Am Yisrael after Yetziat Mitzrayim is V'igala televincha, by connecting the parents to the children, the fathers to the son. This is the netzach, the eternity of Am Yisrael. This is what allows us to remember Torah Moshe Avdi, and therefore this is the fulfillment of the bris of Eliyahu Navi. Okay, so till now we've dealt with the second half of the first chapter of Kiddushin. Now, another question that many Achronim have dealt with is that there's seemingly two topics to the first chapter of Masechet Kiddushin. The first half deals with kinyanim. It begins with Haisha nikneit. It continues by Avadim nikneim, Karkoot, etc., etc. The second half deals with mitzvot. And one question, beginning with the achronim that they deal with, is what is the relationship between the first half of the parak to the second half of the parak? And a number of answers have been given. But first, I'd like to give a literary point to express that this is that there's something very deliberate about the structure of our parak. If we would look at the first half, we would see there are exactly 10 kinyanim. One moment. So apparently I did not put the list here. Okay, if you go through the list of the parak, we'll one second. And then between Isha, Isha nekneit, Yavama, Eved Ivri, Eved Kanani, Be'ema Gasa, Nechasim Sheyesh Achrayot. Ultimately, there are 10 kinyanim in the first half of the parak. In the second half of the parak, and this I did bring a chart over here, there are 10 principles relating to mitzvot. If you look at the chart here, Kol mitzvot ha'av ben, Kol mitzvot aben ala'av, Kol mitzvot, there are exactly 10 principles of mitzvot, and there are 10 categories of kinyan in the first half, which I feel highlight that there's a very deliberate structure here, and that Rebbe put together these two topics in one parak. It's coming to teach us something. So one of the answers that the achronim have raised here is the Pnei Yeshua says the connection between the first half and the second half is the first half is about the first half is kinyanim, is the material kinyanim, and the second half, it rules about mitzvot, is giving us a spiritual kinyanim, meaning it's all about kinyanim, but there's kinyanim of olam hazeh and kinyanim of olam haba, material kinyanim and spiritual kinyanim. So that's one beautiful answer by the Pnei Yeshua. Rav Wolfish, his approach was looking at it as a linear progression. The parak begins with kinyanim, the building of a home, beginning first with the Kiddushin and the kinyanim building up the home. Afterwards, continue with the mitzvot, and the parak ending with nachala. The ultimately by putting it all together, we achieve our eternal nachala. I would like to offer a different approach, which is going to be based on what I spoke about earlier, about what is the relationship between the first half and the second half. Now, for this, I'd like to, there is a Mishnah that deeply links the two halves of the parak. This is a point also made by Rav Wolfish. Let's take a look at Mishnah Vav. In Mishnah Vav, it says, Kol hanaseh damim, and I'll try to end with as much time as possible for discussion, because I believe, okay, so hopefully with Kol hanaseh damim b'acher, kevin shezacha zeh, nitchayev zeh b'chalifin. Ketzad, Ichlif shur b'para, chamor b'shur, kevin shezacha zeh, nitchayev zeh b'chalifav. So here, we have a Mishnah which somehow is a linking between the two halves. On one hand, we're talking about a phenomena called chalifin, barter, which this clearly, presumably should be connected to the first half of the parak, because presumably chalifin, barter, is a phenomena of kinyan. On the other hand, the terminology used in this Mishnah, nitchayev, is relevant to the second half of the parak. In the second half of the parak, relating to the 10 principles of mitzvot, there the terminology is nitchayev. Kol mitzvot ha'av aben alav anashim chayavim v'anashim p'turot, etc., etc. So here we see part of the masterpiece of the structure of the parak, a phenomena of kinyan, which connects us to the first half, but a terminology of chiyuv, which connects up to the second half. So I would like to use this Mishnah as the key to understand the relationship between the two halves of the parak. Now, I said that the phenomena in Mishnah Vav is of kinyan, but the word kinyan is not mentioned here. And this it gets to the heart of what kinyan is about. In Chazal, kinyan is something very tangible, very physical. We know that essentially we pass like Rabbi Yochanan, Davar Torah ma'ot eno konot. By passing over money, you don't make a kinyan. Kinyan takes place only when you physically bring the object over to you. As we say, possession is 9/10 of the law. In halacha, to kinyan, the physical control of the object is critical to create the transfer of ownership and make you into the Baalim. That being the case, this explains why in our Mishnah, the word chalipin, the word kinyan doesn't show up. Because when you do chalifin is not kinyan. And maybe this could explain why is it, the Gemara tells us, if I want, one of the early sugyot in Kiddushin, Daf Gimel, why an isha eno niklet b'chalifin. Because chalifin is not a kinyan. What is it? It's nitchayev. It's a itchayvut. When you're machlif para b'chamor, the person who is moshech, who takes to him the animal, takes the shore, by doing that, he is zocher, meaning he is the owner of that. But by doing that, the other person does not become the owner, but it says nitchayev. And in manuscript nitchayev, I have taken ownership, and through that I have created hitchayvut. I have created an obligation, but it's obligation and not yet ownership. But I feel the message here gets to the heart of the message of our entire parak. What is this Mishnah telling us? It's saying that when you are zocheh in something, when you are making a kinyan in something, that has ramifications. That kinyan that you've gotten, that you're zocheh in, this creates hitchayvut. This creates obligations. And this is the essence of the structure of our chapter. The first half talks about kinyanim. A person is zocheh for kinyanim. He's zocheh for isha, karka. But the message is, kevan shezacha nitchayev. You were zocheh for kinyanim. Part of these kinyanim bring about hitchayvut. And ultimately, the essential hitchayvut of the person who was zochah for these kinyanim is hitchayvut of mitzvot. And this gets to the essence of the Brit in Chorev that Sefer Malachi talks about Zichru Torah Moshe Avdi. Sefer Dvarim is telling us that we are zocheh to inherit the land. Again, this is what we see in Mishnah Yud. Oseh mitzvah, metivim lo, marichim lo, yabav nochel et haaretz, inherit the land, but through the fulfillment of Torah. So there's a circular Brit over here. We have kinyanim. The kinyanim themselves lead to a requirement of mitzvot. By the kinyan of Kiddushin, this leads to children, which leads to your chiyuv mitzvot ha'av ben. The kinyanim naturally lead to the chiyuvim. And by fulfilling those chiyuvim, by fulfilling the mitzvot, we are zocheh for nachala. And the nachala returning us to, again, restoring the cycle of kinyanim. So we have a circle of kinyan, zechut leading to chovot, obligations, fulfillment of obligations leading to the nachala. And here again, to again quote Rav Wolfish, he shows how the first Mishnah is so connected to the last Mishnah. The first Mishnah begins with Haisha niknek b'shalosh drachim, and we have, for example, the V'chut hameshulash lo b'meheri tanek, and he has a whole chart of the interconnections between the beginning of the parak and the end of the parak, to see how, which I think helps the point that I would like to bring of how embedded they are with one another. So here we have an example of this chapter in the context of which seeing the root of the psukim underlying it. And there's some methodological points. I would like to review the methodological points made in the argument I made today, because these are general points that again can be used throughout the Mishnah. And I'm grateful and happy to mention that my book Nishmat Mishnah in August is coming out in English by Magid Press. We spoke about, when studying Mishnayot, seeing that often they are stories, psukim in Tanakh, not necessarily directly relating to the topic at hand, that are underlying the Mishnah and being a key to what's happening there. We take a look at structure, seeing that a Mishnah, different topics, we should think about why they're together. This is part of our respect to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, that there isn't a random putting together of topics, but there is thought behind them, and we should try to uncover that thought. And looking at the patterns, the numbers, often there's typological numbers that could clue us in that there's something very deliberate. We saw this here about the 10 kinyanim in the first half and the 10 principles of mitzvot in the second half. And then again, we took close note of language when we saw that Mishnah, which is the linkage between the two halves, how they're using chiyuv, how they're using words to create that connection. And also you're looking at the words to help us even look on the lumdis level to highlight the difference between chalipin and Kiddushin, what it gives us yet another explanation why it is that Isha lo niknet be-Kiddushin. Okay, so I think we have about 10 minutes left, and I'd be happy for any responses, questions about this parak, or or possibly even things relating to that, the first sugya, because maybe I will say a few words. I'm not sure what was defined by the first sugya, but if you had Rabbi Brandes speaking, I'm sure the first sugya is first sugya kipshuto of the Sabaray, what Rav Shiragon says, the sugya of the Sabarayim, which in many ways darshins the Mishnah, ha'isha nikneit b'shlos drachim, just like Chazal darshan psukim, taking each of those words and doing a drasha on it, not necessarily pshat, but seeing how this is a vehicle to, at the beginning of the Masechta, to bring out the fundamental ideas in that Masechta. So I imagine, I don't know if Rev Brandes has Rev Brandes spoken yet? Right, so you probably spoke about the yisod that he learned from Rev Gustman about the fact that it's kesef shtar v'bia as reflecting three different aspects of a marriage relationship and how this comes to play in that introductory Masechet. In general, the first sugyot in Shas and Masechtas, often, if you look at an external way, you might feel that there's a shakla v'tarya that seems to be asking questions that aren't serious questions and answers that seems to have taken a long time for them to get to these obvious answers. But part of what we should realize is the beautiful craftsmanship of Chazal in building these introductory sugyas to Masechtot, because often within them there are information and principles that are important for the entire Masechet. For example, in Baba Kama, begins with the question of avoteam kiyotzibem, toldoteim kiyotzibem, or toldoteim lav kiyotzibem. Are toldot yes or not like the avot? There's a simple answer that takes the Gemara 2 dapim to tell us. But as was once pointed out to me by David Weiss Halivni, that those 2 dapim, through the question of avoteim kiyotzibem or not kiyotzibem, raised every av, and defined every Av and gave us the Toldot. And by the time you've got to Daf Gimel Amud Bet, you've done much more than answering the question Rav Papa has asked at the beginning, but you've gotten many of the key information and concepts that will help you with the continuation of the Masechta. So in many Masechtot, this is the case. We're now learning, so that's also a methodological point to keep in mind. Okay, so I'd like to leave the last minutes for any responses or questions. So please let me bring the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. If we could ask people to unmute themselves if they would like to raise a question, that would be wonderful.
I have a question, if it's okay, Mark.
Go ahead, Michael, please.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you, Rav Nagen. I'm happy your book, Nishmat Mishnah, is coming out in English. It is. I've been using it for a number of years, certainly in the Hebrew edition, and it's been excellent and really helpful. This may be an odd question, and I don't want to take this too far out of bounds. Is there any connection between your methods here in understanding Mishnah and your own efforts in interreligious work in Israel? In other words, are these just two different aspects of you? Or is there something internally that's reflected in your methodology that has also allowed you to engage the way you're engaging on many fronts?
Well, so first of all, thank you for the question. I think it's a really great question. And maybe before answering it, there's on the pasuk we've dealt with today, there's a beautiful drasha by Rav Eliyahu ben Moseg, who wrote a book called Israel and Humanity, about the connection of the Am Yisrael and the Umat Olam. And he darshans that last pasuk of Veheshiv lev avot al banim v'lev ban avotam as a hope for a future that the avot, the fathers, which is Am Yisrael, the ancient Brit and tradition, will be reconciled to the sons, which would be religions following Avram Avinu that sprung out of Judaism, meaning he's referring first to Christianity and Islam, to find some future in which the sons become reconciled and find that they're no longer in conflict. Relating to your question, I feel part of the issue is being able, I think part of it is looking, there's a saying of the French author Marcel Proust, that the challenge of life is not discovering new lands, but seeing the older ones with new eyes. And I think part of it is feeling that to look anew at things. Looking anew at things is something that helps lead to new methodologies in learning of Mishnah, Gemara. New eyes would also say that in questions such as what after Kum Medinat Yisrael and Shivat Zion, and the beginning of fulfillment of Nevuot of Achrit HaYamim, what should we be thinking about? What's the relationship of Am Yisrael and Umat HaOlam? It's looking anew at these questions, lead maybe different approaches to things. Another common denominator, I feel, there's a question about mashmu'ut, of meaning. Part of my methodologies in Limud Mishnah, Limud Gemara, is finding what is the mashmu'ut, and here too I feel part of it is looking at sugyot, whether it's halachic or ashkafic sugyot, by looking for the mashmu'ut and trying to understand it, it might lead you to different directions. I mean, I just finished writing extensively on the sugya about limud Torah to goyim. Now, on the surface, the halachic discussions could be very much goy shalomei Torah chayev mita, and very much dealing with the when there is or isn't a heter. But if you're looking both with new eyes and for meaning and significance, you'll be dealing with questions. How is it if Tanakh tells us ki mitzion tetzei Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim, if the Gemara also tells us goy shalomei Torah ki kohen gadol, how could I understand and relate to this statement of Rav Yochanan, a goy shalomei Torah chayev mita? when you start searching, that often will lead you into directions that gives you different perspectives on things. So I think thank you for the question. I think that these issues are connected. Okay, do we have time for another question?
Maybe one or two more, if anybody has. So, Rabbi Nagen, your approach is you didn't learn in yeshiva. So how did you come to this? How did you have these new eyes that enabled you to do this?
Okay, well, first of all, I do feel a lot of hakarat tov from learning learning at yeshiva. Both my direct rebbeim when I was when YU was Rav Aaron Soloveitchik and also Rav Michael Rosenzweig, and I felt that this. I have an article I once wrote for the Orthodox Forum called "Scholarship and Spirituality" and "Spirituality and Scholarship," and there I try to trace my personal development, and in general the issue about what does it mean to learn Gemara, and I feel there are many stages on the way, meaning the way. The approaches that I did learn, I feel this is just a continuation of, if once in yeshivot would be asking a kasha on Tosfot and answering the kasha is something which is a worthy question, but to think about the type of conceptual analysis that in general Brisk brought to the world, Rav Soloveitchik brought to the world, and I learned by Rav Lichtenstein and Rav Rosenzweig and Rav Aaron. I felt these were giving us much more conceptual thinking about the issues. So true, they would make a distinction between what is said and now why is it said. They would not deal with questions of meaning, but I see this more as like it's a continuum that people could decide deliberately where's the right place for them to stop on this continuum. But I feel the movement between the Marsha and Rav Soloveitchik is both are Eilu V'Divilukim Chaim, but that journey is greater than the journeys that I've taken since then. So I feel that I'm a continuation and a branch from the tree of yeshiva, and very grateful to be connected. And I think many of the people on these methodologies, something I mentioned in the article, you would think that the people talk about Torah Eretz Yisrael, but many of the people who are working on these lines are people who learned in yeshiva in some way. I mentioned extensively Rav Avi Wolfish, who developed the approach to Mishnah, a more conceptual understanding, who is a Talmuder of Soloveitchik, very connected to the world of yeshiva. So one of the things I deal with, the irony is that with all the discussion of Torah Eretz Yisrael, in many ways it's Rav Soloveitchik's Talmidim and Talmidim of Talmidim who have developed this approach much more, for example, than the Talmidim of Rav Kook, for example, in Merkaz Harav or in Haramor.
Thank you.
So
on behalf of
proud to be a yeshiva graduate.
The development department of YU will be sending you a thank you letter in your future.
Certainly. And let me, okay, if we are at the end, let me just mention that part of my noheg of shirim is I start shirim with the Zeh Yom Aseh Hashem Nagil Mischabo, but I feel we need balance in our lives, in our Avodat Hashem. So if I begin with the Simcha, I always end with the Pasuk in Kohelet, Sof Davar, Hakol Nishma, Et Elohim Yira, Ve'et Mitzvotav Shmor, Ki Zeh Kol Hadam. A pleasure being with all of you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so very much on behalf of those who were here and those who will be learning from you in the recording. And we thank you very, very much for your time and your insights.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
So we're going to take a break now for 15 minutes. The line will remain open. We will begin Rav Rosenzweig's shir in Derech Brisk in 15 minutes.